part of what inspired this book, it was twofold. The first was I was meeting a lot of people who were seeking healing. They wanted help. And they had found themselves reading books and texts that suggested that healing was sort of a one-time affair, that you should be able to be healed, sort of one-off, and then be fine. And that is not the experience of a lot of people I know. That's not my experience, and I don't think that's what it means to be healed. I don't think that's an authentic Catholic vision of healing. And I'll explain that a little bit, but that's part of what inspired this book. How can we say we're healed and still be suffering? The second thing I noticed was a bit less maybe virtuous. Rob sort of alluded to it poetically. I say it's something like, there's like all these people who I see at Mass who have been receiving the Eucharist, Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity for decades, and they're miserable SOBs. They're just, like, we know them. You're like, this guy's been going to Mass every morning. I see him every Wednesday at Mass, daily Mass. And he's like, he's a wretched, miserable person. How? How is that the case? How can that possibly be true? So part of what I wanted to do in this book was give an account of how I think that can be the case and how I think we can heal. Okay, so I made this PowerPoint. I think it's beautiful. It's floral themed. Enter into the healing sort of mindset. So the first question, I want to start with this question. What is a wound? I kind of want to get right into the heart of it. What is a wound? My definition of a wound is this. A wound is the distress that arises when we're not loved the way we were created to be loved. A wound is the distress that arises. It's that absence, that lack, that pain that arises from failing to be loved the way you were created to be loved. And that can be from people, that can be from institutions, that can be from the world at large. Or to be wounded is to be blocked or obstructed from loving the way you were created to love. I think wounds also arise when there's a block or an impediment or a barrier to loving the way we want to. What I mean by that is I oftentimes will work with and have worked with women who have had miscarriages or lost children. And like, how do we account for that wound? What is that wound? Part of that wound is there's this like deep mother's heart, this desire to love the way a mother's heart was made to love, and that has been blocked or obstructed. And a wound arises when we're not able to live in the kind of love that God has created us for, to receive or to give. That's when a wound arises. Okay. I want to give sort of an account of how I think wounds happen. So one way to think about this, I think there's a lot of ways to think about this, but one way is, okay, 3 levels. The functional level. What do I mean by functional? Functional level is your behaviors, it's your thoughts, it's your actions in the day-to-day. Your functional behaviors, thoughts, right? It's today I thought my life's falling apart. I'm so tired. I can't wait for the end of the semester. Today I got bored and distracted at work and surfed YouTube longer than I'd like to admit. Today I laid on the couch when I got home. Like, these are functional behaviors. Behaviors, thoughts, actions, this sort of thing. Okay. What gives rise to those? What gives rise to those is what's called the contextual level, or another way of thinking about the contextual level is our schemas, our ways of thinking about the world. The way I view the world shapes my behaviors, my thoughts, my actions daily. Those are rooted in a fundamental way of seeing the world. If I think, like if my way of seeing the world is I'm lonely, nobody likes me, I have no friends, I can't handle hard things, it gives rise to a certain set of functional behaviors. Okay, now the question is, what gives rise to our schemas or our thoughts, our contexts? And that's relationships. Fundamentally, I think that what drives so much of the way we think about the world, so much of our current behavior, is like early childhood relationships. It's our interactions with people. I was talking to there's a book that just came out called Bad Therapy. And I haven't read it. I have a philosophy friend who has read part of it, and he sort of explained it to me, and he's very critical of it. But part of what she does in her chapter on trauma, Abigail Schreier, she says something like, look, we have big T trauma and little t trauma, and big T trauma is when you think like you're going to be exploded or killed or hurt. And she's like, but modern psychology wants to talk about little t trauma, like relational traumas. And she said, like, this is, like, she kind of alludes to this being sort of soft and weak, you know? This is like our grandfathers didn't have little t trauma, you know? They, like, rubbed dirt in the wound and carried on, you know? And the more I live, the longer I do therapy, the more I take seriously the idea of relational trauma. And the reason I take this seriously is because I take very seriously the early Genesis account. I take very seriously this idea that we are made in the image and likeness of a God who is in his very nature a communion of persons. That what that means is that we are made for union and communion with one another. At least in part, what that means is that we're made for union and communion with one another. Like, how do we torture prisoners? Not torture prisoners. How do we punish prisoners? We also torture prisoners. But we do that like in black sites, not on U.S. soil. How do we punish prisoners? We put them in jail, sort of isolate them. Well, how do you punish the worst of the worst prisoners? What's the greatest punishment apart from the death penalty? Solitary confinement. It's the greatest punishment we have for a living human being. And what happens when we put people in solitary confinement? Overwhelmingly, they decompensate. They start to lose their minds. We're made for union and communion with one another. And so I think that is so bred into our very bone that I think we can talk about relational traumas. I think we can talk about when a mother or father leaves, that it is traumatic. It's traumatic because it is like, it should be unfathomable. You're so made for the stability of relationship. And there's a whole body of research, the early childhood attachment literature in psychology that talks about how important relationships are for your brain development. I mean, it's just... So I think we can talk about little t traumas. So I really think so many of our problems arise from like early childhood and relational experiences. They give us our view of the world. So much of the learning that you carry with you into today was shaped by these early childhood relationships. And part of what that means is that the failures of your parents to love you the way you were created to be loved has shaped how you see the world. I want to tell you a little bit about my dad. So my dad, his name is Mick Breuninger. My dad is from inner city Philadelphia, like rough inner city Philadelphia. My dad is the toughest man I know. He's a very, very tough human being. And so by way of example, maybe 2 years ago now, my dad was probably 63, 64. He says, let's go see a Pirates-Phillies game. He's a diehard Phillies fan. Let's go see a Pirates-Phillies game. So we take my 5 kids and my mom, who has terrible MS and is basically in a wheelchair. We're sitting in front of 20 drunk college kids from Grove City, right? And they're using really foul language. And at one point, my dad looks over at me and he says, let's get out of here. We're leaving. And I was like, nah. So first of all, the Phillies were losing 7-1. And he has very little patience for that. But he said, we're out of here. And I said, Dad, I'm just going to ask them to clean up their language. I'm just going to ask them to stop. And he looked at me, he got real serious, and he said, just so you know, I'm not taking any stuff off of them, okay? But he didn't say stuff, right? There's this line, if you've seen A Christmas Story, I've said this before, if you've seen A Christmas Story, there's this great line where Ralphie says, my father worked in profanity the way some men worked in oils and clay. It was his preferred medium. That's my dad. My dad is artistic with his verbal expressions. So let me boil down what he said to me, to you. He said, like, in essence, I'm going to fight 20 drunk college kids if they talk back to you, right? And I promise you, it would have been a tornado of fit. They wouldn't have known, like they weren't ready. They're not ready, like they're not cut from the same cloth, you know? That's my dad. 2 more examples, just to give you a sense of like these early childhood experiences. I tend to be a pretty sensitive kid. I was just a sensitive kid. I was kind of fearful. I really was like sort of a lover, not a fighter. So I remember one of the first times I ever got picked on in grade school. Some kid said something to me on the playground, and I came home. And I told my dad. My dad said, tomorrow on the playground, you walk up to him, you put your finger in his chest, and you say, if you ever so much as look at me again, I'm going to smash your teeth into the back of your head. Right? But I want you to pepper it with profanity. Just imagine, use your imagination to figure out where different profanities might be interspersed there, right? Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing, probably 8th grade. This kid called me a terrible racial slur. I was crushed. I was crushed. And I went home and I told my dad about it. My dad put on his nicest suit. My dad never put on a suit. My dad put on his nicest suit. He went over to the kid's house, knocked on the door. We're about to have a tornado. Like that. So he knocks on the door. Mrs. Johnson comes to the door. Hey, Mrs. Johnson, is your husband home? Hey, Bill. Bill comes to the door, and my dad says, if your son so much as looks at my son again, I'm going to come back here and smash your teeth into the back of your head. Right? Okay. Only, imagine it peppered, right? Gently with profanity, right? I tell you this because growing up as a pretty sensitive kid who was fearful, there were parts of myself that I learned that my father couldn't handle, didn't want to see, was unable to deal with. Like my fear and my anxiety wasn't able to be held by my dad. Couldn't do it. So I learned pretty early on to see the world like you don't share fear and anxiety with people. Fear and anxiety is a weakness. You don't share that with people. So my relational experiences shaped my schemas, my context, which gave rise to a whole bunch of functional thoughts and behaviors and actions. I operated from the fundamental belief system and structure that you don't share fear and anxiety with people. You shove that down, you pretend, and in fact, when you feel anxious, get aggressive. That was the first thing. The second thing I learned from my dad was there was only one person who was allowed to be angry in the house. Can you guess who that was? Yeah. Mick Breuninger, right? I learned, I'll never forget the handful of times that I started to get angry, sharpen my old adolescent chops a little bit. Let me tell you something, Mom. And I would hear this booming voice that just said, knock it off. And you just knew. You just stopped. Second thing I learned, anger doesn't have a place. What I learned was that anger was unpredictable, chaotic, and I learned to be afraid of anger. The problem with that is, as I grow up into adolescence and young adulthood, what do I do with my own anger? What happens when that arises in me? I have to shut it down. It feels unpredictable. It feels chaotic. It feels unsafe. So I'll never forget praying once. I'd come back to the church and I was kneeling down praying and I was talking to God and I said, God, thank you so much for all your gifts and blessings. I'm so grateful for today. And then I realized I was lying. I wasn't grateful. I was angry. I was afraid. But I had no concept of how to begin to express that to God. My schema, my early childhood relationships gave rise to a set of beliefs and how I saw the world that shaped how I acted functionally. And so what I did was whenever I felt angry, I would pretend to be happy. Whenever I felt afraid, I would pretend to be confident and competent. Okay, I bring this up because what I want to highlight is the importance of these early relational experiences. And now let me give you a little, why talk about wounds? I think it's important to talk about wounds because I think they give us an insight into our own personalities. I'm going to try to lay out for you over the course of this talk a little bit how I think so much of our personalities are actually just self-protection strategies that we've adopted to protect ourselves from the pain and suffering of our wounds. John Elridge has this great quote. He says, "Rarely have you ever met a real man. What you've met is an elaborate fig leaf." You know how in the garden Adam and Eve cover up and hide? His point is that so much of our personalities is us covering up and hiding. So much of who we think we are is actually what I've learned to keep myself safe in those early childhood experiences. How do I get love? How do I get attention? How do I get affection? How do I reduce my anxiety? How do I feel safe? How do I navigate the dynamics of my family? I adopt all these strategies and personality traits and characteristics in order to achieve a certain sense of safety and security. And the problem is they're oftentimes very attractive on the surface. Like, some of you guys are the really, really helpful ones. I just love serving people. But when we really dive into our woundedness, sometimes what we realize is what we learned was that if I became really good at helping people, my mom wouldn't be so angry, or my dad wouldn't be so disengaged, or people wouldn't fight as much, and I'd feel safer. Some of you guys are the funny ones. Some of you guys are the shy ones. Some of you guys are the ones who talk a lot and are really gregarious and extroverted. One of the reasons we look at our wounds is because by looking at our wounds, we oftentimes see the parts of our personality that we've taken for granted have actually been adopted as self-protection and self-preservation. So it's a part of getting to know ourselves more deeply and coming to know our honest, authentic selves. The second reason is because our wounds oftentimes shape how we respond to ourselves, others, and the world. Some part of how I live in the world is oftentimes shaped by my wounds. And this is particularly important because this shapes how I encounter the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. But my woundedness gives rise to a self-protection that I encounter the Father with. So I'm saying something like, "Father, I need you. I love you. I want you. Bring it to me, Father. Come here. Yeah, bring it in. Bring it in." And I'm keeping one hand up and saying, "I want that intimacy, Lord." Right? Wrap those loving arms around me. Mary, put your loving mantle around me. But I got the guns drawn in self-protection, and I'm going, "Mary, just wrap your protective arm." Right? And then I'm going, like, I don't know why I don't feel Mary's love. Like, I don't know why I'm not changing. Like, I think that's the answer. This is the answer to the question, how is it we can receive the Eucharist, Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity, for decades and never be changed? Because we're receiving him with our full-blown self-protective strategies in play. And the way we get changed by our Lord is to be touched, to have our authentic selves touched. He can't touch the mask. He can't transform the mask. Imagine trying to be intimate. Imagine a husband and wife who seek intimacy. Right? This is the image our Lord uses. It's like he loves us the way a bride loves a bridegroom. Imagine seeking intimacy between spouses, and you've got two snowsuits on. You know, like there's no intimacy when you have a snowsuit on. Right? It's a barrier. It's probably a terrible example. This isn't live, is it? We can edit this, right? My point is, what we're seeking in the Eucharist is intimacy. And what will change us ultimately is our Lord's love, to be touched by his love. If wounds arise from a failure to be loved, what heals us is the touch of love. But I'm not touched by the Lord's love when I'm wearing my self-protection. So part of what I need to do, one of the reasons I need to become familiar with my wounds is because when I understand my wounds, I understand my self-protection. And when I understand my self-protection, what I see is the barriers that are blocking me from God's grace. So that's why we look at our wounds. And so this is the problem with wounds. The problem isn't that you're wounded. That's not the problem. In some ways, this is a disappointing talk. I wish I kind of believed that you just like say this one prayer And like, it'll all be gone, y'all. All that pain and hurt, it's just going to be gone. I don't think it is. I don't think that's oftentimes the case. I think this side of the beatific vision, what we're promised is the cross. I think you are going to suffer. What I want to help you get back to is suffering well. The problem when we act from our woundedness is we're not suffering well. We're reactive, we're controlling, we're withdrawing, we're not able to hold our suffering and carry our cross. The problem isn't our wounds, the problem is how we've chosen to cope with them. The problem is how we've chosen to cope with them. The problem is that the self-protection strategy, and I call them self-protection because I think they really are things that we adopt to help us feel safe and secure. I think they really are strategies that we adopt that help us feel safe and competent and good enough and smart enough and secure. They serve a purpose. The problem is our self-protection strategies become our prison. Your self-protection becomes your prison. If you always have to be the really, really kind, nice one, what happens when you're really tired and fed up with mistreatment? If you have to be the one who can never speak their mind because you're so afraid of people leaving you, you're between a rock and a hard place. You either have to deny yourself and your experience, or you have to risk somebody leaving you. Your self-protection becomes a prison. What worked to help you feel safe and secure early on now keeps you stuck. The problem isn't our woundedness. The problem is our self-preservation. We learn to cut off parts of ourselves. We learn to deny our feelings. We learn to quelch our desires. All for the sake and purpose. I can't tell if God's angry at me. Am I wrong? Am I wrong? We learn to cut ourselves off from these experiences, from ourselves, in order to gain an initial sense of security. But we're ultimately left feeling unhappy, miserable. And in the book, I make all sorts of distinctions that I think are too academic, and I could talk about them later if you want. But part of what happens in our life is our wound and suffering becomes the center of our reality. It's like our suffering is at the center, and everything else we have to organize and orchestrate around our suffering. I'm going to talk about St. Paul in a little bit. St. Paul's a great example of this. St. Paul has this thorn in his flesh that he talks about, and he asks the Lord to remove the thorn 3 times. And the Lord doesn't remove the thorn. Now, we all have thorns. The thorns are our sufferings, our wounds. What most of us do with our wounds and our thorns is we try to orchestrate life and people and situations to not have our thorn pressed. I don't want you to touch my thorn because that's going to hurt. So I cover it. I'm the funny guy. I'm the quiet girl. I'm the really, really smart one. I intellectualize it. We have all these ways of preventing our thorn from being touched. And when we do that, we're not free. We're a slave to our wound. When we do that, we're not free. Our suffering is the center of our life, and everything else has to be ordered and orchestrated around our suffering, around our wound. And instead, what we're after is we want to put the Blessed Trinity, we want to put Christ at the center of our lives and let everything else revolve around that, including our suffering. But oftentimes we have it reversed, right? Okay. What is healing? I want to give you my definition of healing. So I think to be healed is to be set free to love the way you were created to love. This gets underemphasized, I think. There's no great mystery here. Like, your purpose in life is to be a profound monstrance of love. Like, that's it. And I think part of what makes life feel hard and confusing is we forget that very simple, profound mission we have. Every day when I'm living the way I want to live and I'm supposed to live, I wake up, I hit my knees and I say, God, I'm totally yours. Do whatever you want with me. Allow me to be of maximum service, to be a loving monstrance to my fellow man. I'll do whatever you ask me to do, Lord. Like, that is the purpose of each and every one of your lives. To be profound and radical monstrances of God's love. That's it. And I bring that up because my definition of healing is to be able to love the way you were created to love. Now you'll notice that definition doesn't have in it that to be healed is to be free from suffering. No, to be healed is to be free to bring your suffering with you as you go wherever the Lord calls you. Healing is about freedom. It's about not being a slave to your pain and your wounds and saying, oh, I can't do that, Lord. I'm sorry, that's going to hurt. I can't go there, Lord. I'm sorry, that's going to be painful. To say, Lord, I'll go wherever you call me. I'll do whatever you want, and I'll bring my suffering with me. I still get nervous when I talk. I still feel insecure. I had a conversation with my wife 2 days ago. Something happened, and I just felt embarrassed. I felt like a little kid. And I felt insecure, and I felt silly. And in the past, I would have reacted to that. I hate that feeling. I don't want to feel silly or embarrassed or insecure. So I would have gotten puffed up with pride, and I would have showed her just what a man she married, you know? Well, man, babe, I'll impress you. I don't feel shy. I don't feel scared. I don't feel insecure. I would have reacted. And in my reaction, I would have made life worse. Instead, I was able to just hold those feelings. I was able to just feel small and insecure and silly and embarrassed and not react to it. I was able to still play with my kids the way I think God wanted me to play with them. I was able to engage with my wife the way I think He wanted me to engage with her. And at the end of the night, I was able to say, babe, I felt really embarrassed today. I felt silly. I felt insecure. I didn't have to puff myself up with pride. I didn't have to become the intellectual. I didn't have to be the tough guy, the macho man, I didn't have to pretend like I wasn't feeling hurt and be totally false and fake and phony. I was able to love the way I think God wanted me to love and to just bring those feelings with me. It didn't feel great. But I think to be healed is to not have to react out of my woundedness. To be healed is to be free to love and free to receive love. Because not only are you called to love, but you're called to receive love. And when I'm not healed adequately, I cannot receive love from others. I was talking to a mother recently. I gave this talk to some donors here at the St. Paul Center a while back. And one of the mothers came up to me and said, I have no problem loving people. I'm actually really good at that. But I can't let people love me. I cannot be on the receiving end. It doesn't feel good. And in that case, you're not free. If I can't receive, if I can't have that openness and vulnerability to receive somebody else's tender love and care, I'm not free. So, a couple definitions. To be healed is to be free to love and to receive love. Another definition is to be able to suffer well. To be healed is to be able to suffer well. I want you to be able to get back to good old-fashioned suffering, you know? Not the kind of suffering we do where we're suffering, then we want to protect ourselves from that suffering, so we create a whole bunch of subsequent pain in our life in our reaction to our suffering. No. I want you to just be able to get back to the cross in your life. St. Paul is the model for this. So anyone know the end of that story? St. Paul asks our Lord to remove the thorn. And our Lord says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in your weakness. So then we say, like, we scratch our heads, like, did the Lord leave St. Paul unhealed? And I don't think we want to say that. I think what we want to say is Paul was healed. What Paul was given was the freedom to go wherever Jesus called him and to bring his suffering with him. But he was able to love the way he was created to love. And let me add to this, I think this is really important. In that type of healing, your suffering becomes a means of grace and sanctification for others because our Lord uses it. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is a tremendous example of this. So AA has this line in their book. And by the way, if you want to meet some of the holiest men and women that you will have ever met in your life, some of the true living saints, modern living saints, go to the rooms of AA. Not all of them. Some of them are crazy. Like everywhere. But there are living saints in the rooms of AA because AA has a really simple philosophy. AA says if you want to overcome your alcoholism and your drug addiction, you need a radical spiritual experience. Your entire life needs to be reoriented to be of maximum service to God. That's it. And if you focus on that, everything else will fall into line. And there's this curious line in the book in AA. It says, no matter how far down the scale we've gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That these men and women who have had these profoundly difficult and painful experiences, and I've worked with alcoholics and addicts, I've worked with men and women who have hurt and harmed their children in the name of drug and alcohol use. What they find is that this type of healing I'm talking about, I call in the book redemptive healing, where your suffering doesn't go away, but God buys it back to himself. To redeem means to be bought back. God buys your wound back to himself and says, I'm going to use this in my service. The men and women of Alcoholics Anonymous are able to use their past experiences to bring hope, to bring light, and to bring love to others. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That means no matter how bad you've gotten, no matter how bad things have been for you, you will see how God will use your suffering to be of service to others. The problem with this view of healing I'm laying out is healing is a daily experience. To be healed is a daily experience. It's to wake up and say to God, I'm totally yours today, and to renew that every day. I'm yours. Allow me to love the way you created me to love. Remove the obstacles and barriers that get in my way from doing that. Give me the strength and courage to carry my cross, and then you go. Today, Christ is the center of my life and not my suffering. But the beauty of that means that I can actually hold my suffering much better. So, what does healing begin with? Rather than going through the steps in the book, if you really want to know the steps in the book, you can buy the book for the low price of $22.99. $15. You're getting the friends and family discount, y'all. And I'll even sign, somebody asked, Dr. Breuninger, would you sign your book? Which I still think is like, I'm from Scranton, Pennsylvania, guys. Okay? I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The fact that anyone wants my signature is very funny to me. So if you want to know the 6 steps, I lay them out in the book. And part of what these 6 steps are is they ask you to identify your wounds, starting from the beginning. I walk you through a very systematic path of how to look at every wound that's arisen. And look at the self-preservation strategy that you adopted with that wound. And then, and the reason this is important, y'all, is because if you are the problem, I'm trying to figure out how to say this nicely, but like, as long as you're the problem, as long as self-preservation is the problem, then there's hope. If the world is really the problem, if you guys are my problem, I'm going to be miserable forever. If my kids are really my problem, I'm going to be unhappy forever. You are never going to be able to adequately get people to be how and who you want them to be. You are never going to be able to get the world to fall into line just the right way so that you don't feel anxious, angry, overwhelmed, or scared. You're not going to, and we spend a lot of effort, energy, and time trying to do that. Subtly control and manipulate life. If life is the problem, you're going to be miserable. If you're the problem, there's a solution. And so to the extent that we can identify our unhealthy and unhelpful self-preservation strategies, there's hope for change. Yeah, the issue isn't actually my dad. Not anymore. The issue is how I've chosen to relate to him. The issue is how I still hide and cover up and fail to show him and express to him my frustration, my anger, and I've taken steps with that. I've taken risks. I should follow up with my dad. 2 quick stories about my dad. Maybe one quick story. Last summer, we were on a vacation, and we went out for coffee, and we were staying in this Airbnb together, and he said to me, hey, I want to get coffee sometime this week. And I was like, okay. And I immediately went to my wife, and I was like, babe, I wonder what I did. What did I do? You know? Think about that. Think about that view of the world. When your dad says, let's get coffee, you're like, oh, I must have done something. So we go out for coffee, and we sit down, and he says, Matt, I need you to know how proud I am of you. He said, when I watch you parent my grandchildren, I'm so incredibly proud. He said, you're such a different father than I was. And he said, the way I parented you and your brother with aggression and with anger because I was so afraid. And he said, I'm the most fearful man I know. Anger is my dad's self-protection. My dad grew up in an incredibly violent and abusive home, like horribly abusive. A lot of fear, a lot of overwhelm, a lot of stress, and aggression was my dad's way of keeping himself safe. That was his self-preservation, and he brought it into the world with him, and it became his prison. It caused a lot of subsequent problems, including in his relationship with my mom, including in his relationship with my brother and I. But he saw it. And he said, I'm so sorry. I'm the most fearful man I know. And he said, I didn't know what to do with my fear, so I turned to aggression to keep from people seeing my vulnerability. And that was a really beautiful moment. That was a profoundly beautiful moment. I think it highlights what most of us do. I think very often, this is a gentle aside, but very often the sins that we constantly confess, I'm always, I go to confession, Lord, I'm just so impatient with my kids, Father. I'm just so impatient. I'm so impatient. Very often, I think the sins that we're frequently confessing aren't actually, they're sins, so confess them, but I don't think they're the root of the problem. I think we're oftentimes caught up confessing the fruit and not the root. I think oftentimes those are our self-protection strategies. My anger with my kids isn't actually, what's actually there is a fear. I have this profound fear that I'm going to be judged based on how my kids are. This came up when we first moved here. So when we moved here 8 and 9 years ago, we go down to St. Peter's Church, right? This is great. I hope Scott's not watching this. When we moved here 8 or 9 years ago, we started going down to St. Peter's. And St. Peter's is the who's who of Catholicism. Right? You got Dr. Bergsma's down there, Dr. Hahn's down there, Chris is down there, Regis Martin's down there. Frad went there temporarily. It's like the big players of American Catholicism. So in walks Matt Breuninger and his feral children, right? And I will never forget, right, we walk in, and who's sitting in the last row? Dr. Scott Hahn. I kid you not, he's looking up at the mural in the stained glass window, and he's muttering to himself like he's in ecstasy, right? He's unflinchingly looking up like the visionaries in Medjugorje do when they're talking to the Blessed Mother, right? And I'm like, he's in the last row. The glaring problem with that is the only place to sit is somewhere in front of him, right? So I walk in, we sit down, and we're like, 30 seconds into the liturgy, and I have one of my kids is a legitimate genius. He's a savant. He's unbelievable. He's either going to cure cancer or become a South American dictator. He's made for greatness in some way, right? He also has a terrible case of ADHD, and so immediately mass starts, and he's like, deet, 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 and he does this thing. He pinches his eyes, and he's going, deet, deet, and he's rolling around, and I'm going, stop it. What are you doing, right? Hold still. But when you ask a kid who has terrible ADHD to hold still, he does this, and then he goes, I have a stomach ache. Dad, I have a stomach ache. And I'm like, okay, just stop, right? And my oldest son is standing there, and he's like doing this thing with he's got this long, straight hair. He just keeps like doing this thing, and I'm going like, fold your hands. You participate. You know the Latin. You participate, right? The little ones like making a break for the aisle. First of all, I'm doing that thing with all of them where, do you know where you bring every ounce of your being into the front of your mouth? I swear to you, when we get home, I will take away everything you love. Right? The little one makes a break for the aisle, and you just give that little, you just reach out, and it's not a hard grab, it's a pinch. The white church doesn't have the pinch like the black church does. In the black church, the pinch is like the pinch. The white church doesn't have the pinch. St. Peter certainly doesn't have the pinch. But I pinched, and then you hear the, ow, Daddy, ow, stop hurting me. And you're like, right? And I'm a mandatory reporter. Like I have to, you know what I mean? Oh, yeah, I'm dying, right? And who's in the back? Like the single most prominent Catholic in the late 90s and early 2000s, Scott Hahn. My one-day boss. And I got in the van afterward, and I kid you not, I got in the van afterward, and I was anxious, and I was angry. And I started telling my wife, babe, our children are, their behavior is unacceptable. And so I have this beautiful way of wrapping all of this. And so I teach human development. So I start pulling out a 4-year-old at this point should be able to adequately engage in motoric control in such a way that she, right? And I said, the 11-year-old, he's confirmed now. He's an adult in the eyes of the church. He's required to actively participate, babe. I mean, this is unbelievable, right? And I'm looking to her for a little bit of, and she's going, yeah? Mm-hmm. Britt knows now, not everything is what it appears to be, I was angry and I was anxious. Why? Because I needed my kids to be a certain way so I didn't feel insecure and judged by the people who I wanted to impress. Turns out my kids weren't the problem. You know what my kids did? They acted exactly the way kids act. The problem was my excessive need and desire to be liked. The problem was me. That excessive need and desire I have to be liked can be a self-protection strategy. I get real slick in the room. I start politicking, I start shaking hands, I'm kissing babies, right? How you doing? Oh, so good to see you, sister. My man, I like that hair, right? That's self-protection. If you like me, if you're on the same page, if we're vibing, then I'm safe. You're not gonna mock me, you're not gonna tease me, you're not gonna harm me. That's part of what I learned to keep myself safe. The problem with that is, I can usually manage that when it's one-on-one. But add 6 little feral kids and I can't manage them in such a way that you're gonna still be impressed. The baby's screaming, the 11-year-old, right, the 17-year-old. When was the last time you showered, by the way? Because I can smell you now, right? And John Bergsma's sitting in front of us, right? You smell like the Old Testament. Like, what is happening here? So I'm feeling angry and embarrassed. And I bring this up because most of the sins I confess in confession are the fruit, they're my self-protection strategies. But what's happening deep down, right, is like fear. I'm afraid of not being liked. I'm afraid of being judged. I'm afraid of being... So this happens in public. I have to be really careful in public. We'll be in public and we'll be around new people, and right? And I can feel this real strong desire to like be harsh on my kids. Guys, knock it off. What is that? Why am I angry? Why am I anxious right now? Oh, that's my self-protection. That's all that is. That's me allowing my old hurts and wounds to arise and say, I need these people to like me or I won't feel safe. And so in order to get these people to like me, I have to control and manipulate my environment so that you think I'm the best Catholic father therapist there is. You know how much pressure that? I can't even have one of my kids go off the rails because then you're not going to buy my books. Who's going to buy the book? I was so glad my book came out before one of my kids went to jail. You know? Who's going to buy a book with that feels like a lot of pressure. When I'm acting out of self-preservation, I'm not free. I'm not free. That's not how I want to parent my kids at Mass. I want to parent my kids at Mass in such a way that I'm an image of God the Father's love and mercy and kindness and caring. Turns out kids don't really start to learn to love the liturgy when they're being pinched and whisper screamed at. Right? I'm going, God is love. You sit down, He is love. You're in the presence of eternal love. You know? What do you love? Because I'm taking it away tonight. It's like, that's not what I'm after. But when I'm in self-preservation, that's how I'm acting, because I need to get you to be how I need you to be. If we're the problem, then there is a solution. Okay, healing begins with, first is surrender. What do I mean by surrender? I mean that the light shines in the darkness. I mean that we don't grow in holiness by pretending to project figures of light. We grow in holiness by bringing the darkness to consciousness. That I need to be honest and surrender all those parts and places of my mind, of my heart, and of my experience where I'm really and truly suffering. I hear, it's funny, sometimes I'll end up at noon Mass at Franciscan on Sundays, and I hear all these praise and worship songs. And they're always they've always got something like, I give it all to you, Lord. I lay it all down. I surrender. And I look around and everyone's just sort of smiling and surrender it is so hard to truly surrender, to give up every fiber, every bit, every expression of your control, of your ego, to give over those dark places of your mind and heart that you spend a lot of time, effort, and energy hiding from others and from yourself. To admit I'm broken and I'm hurting, and not just in the pretty ways. Some of you guys are really good at talking about the making brokenness poetic. Oh, Dr. B, I am broken. I'm not talking about that part. I'm talking about the part that keeps you awake at night. I'm talking about the part that you want to numb out by scrolling on Instagram. To begin to heal requires looking at the monsters under the bed, searching and fearless. What are those doubts I have? What are those deep insecurities and fears? Is it about my body? Is it about my parents? Is it about my friends? Is it about to surrender? It begins with an act of humility and surrender. Then honesty. I had an experience today. I bumped into a friend and his spouse. And one of my self-preservation strategies is I can be sarcastic. And when I feel like I don't feel like being serious or something's getting too serious at a time when I don't want to be, I can be sarcastic and use humor. And that can get me in trouble. That can hurt people. And I bumped into this friend, and I'd said something that was hurtful. I said it in humor, but I said it because I didn't want to go deep in the moment. And so my self-preservation oftentimes causes harm to other people. And I bumped into this friend today, and it was just sort of frigid and cold, and I felt really sad, really bummed me out. And immediately I feel my mind start going and justifying, well, what kind of Catholics are those people if they can't practice forgiveness and pick themselves up? It's I start going into self-justification. And I had to stop and just be okay with, this hurts, I'm hurting. Part of what it means to begin to heal is to learn to be honest with myself, radically honest with myself. I felt really sad. I felt sad that I hurt my friend. I felt sad that they seemed to want nothing to do with me. It's the kind of honesty that forces me to tell my wife, babe, I felt really silly and embarrassed and like a small child earlier today. And this is hard. This is hard because this is vulnerable. Vulnerability can be terrifying. But the problem is there is no love without vulnerability. There is no love without vulnerability. There is no intimacy between you and your friends. There is no intimacy between you and your spouse. There's no intimacy between you and our Lord without vulnerability. To be vulnerable, to lead with the heart, to be honest with to be honest with your heart is to open yourself up to be hurt. Vulnerability, forgiveness. Healing also requires forgiveness. I have a whole section in the book on how to begin to forgive, to let go. Part of learning to forgive is to the degree that I start to see my own brokenness, in the book I use the language spiritual sickness. All the ways I'm cut off from God. And when I'm cut off from God, I'm in self-protection mode. When I'm cut off from God, I'm in Matt mode and not God mode, right? I'm in self-protection. And when I'm in that mode, I tend to hurt and harm people. My actions tend to hurt and harm people when I'm in self-protection. When I start to realize that about myself, that most of the times when I've hurt and harmed people, it's because I've been spiritually sick. I've been cut off from God. What I start to realize is that when people have hurt and harmed me, it's oftentimes because they're spiritually sick. My father didn't wake up every morning and think gosh, I'm filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. I'm living in the dynamism of God's grace and love, and then choose to hurt me. My father woke up every day grumpy and afraid and miserable and scared and overwhelmed and insecure. Another way of saying it, again, AA says this. They say, hurt people hurt people. Part of me learning to forgive and to heal, to let go of the bitterness and the resentment, is I start to look at other people who have hurt me with compassion, genuine compassion. And how can I look at them with compassion? I start to view them as spiritually sick. It doesn't mean what they did didn't hurt me. It doesn't mean that I don't pretend like I'm immune to pain. But what I begin to realize is that when they hurt me, it's because they're spiritually sick. They're unhappy. They're hurt. And that gives me a certain sense of compassion. And forgiveness oftentimes flows from that for me. And lastly, mission. Healing begins with mission. We need a direction and purpose in life. And yours is not shrouded in mystery. Your mission in life is to love. It's to love. It's to love radically. Not sometimes, not often. Each moment, you are to be this beacon and monstrance of love. That's your purpose. And to the extent that you begin to step into that and take that seriously, Like, why am I here at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night? It's mission. I've made a deal with God that I will serve him and others radically to the best of my ability, because I want to be watching Netflix and eating marshmallows right now, if I'm being totally honest with you. I have a tremendous sweet tooth. I'm like much closer to diabetes than I want to admit. It's one area of my life I've yet to surrender. I want to be watching Netflix. I want to be eating marshmallows. I want to take that a step further for you so you know where my mind is. I want to dip those marshmallows in Nutella, because I have a jar of Nutella sitting on my shelf, and I want to scoop those little marshmallows in Nutella, eat them, and watch a Netflix show. And I'm here at 8 o'clock drinking black tea, which is going to keep me awake until midnight tonight, because I made a deal with God that my purpose in life is no longer about me. My purpose in life is no longer about me. It's about being of radical service to him. Lord, what would you have me do? And I mean that. And so sometimes what he says to me is something like, you need to be home and you need to be playing with your kids. And so I turn down talks. There are some talks I want to take because they'd really be like, I was just offered a talk the other day. I really wanted to take it. Like high dollar, big dogs. I really wanted to take it. And it was like overwhelmingly clear to me that what God was asking me to do was like to serve my family that night instead. My mission isn't about me anymore. It's about radical love and service. And here's the paradox. To the degree that I focus on that mission, I remain and continue to be free and healed. And to the degree that I begin to recognize my self-protection strategies and ask God to remove them, to such a degree I'm able to engage in my mission even more. It's this sort of feedback loop. But I want to challenge you to wake up each day with this new, renewed mission. I make a deal with God every day. I say, God, I will do whatever you want from you. I will do whatever. But I need you to remove my self-protection strategies that get in my way of being of service to you. My fear gets in the way, my anxiety gets in the way, my selfishness, my self-seeking, my pride. And I know them now. I know mine. And I feel them come up. And I say, God, remove it so that I can get back to doing what you're asking me to do, which is to love. It's to live from the heart, to live from this very core of my being, and to bring love into the world. And something amazing happens. To the extent that my self-protection strategies get in the way, God removes them, or diminishes them, or allows them to stand to the side so that I can love the way he wants me to love. And to the extent that I start to grasp at self-protection again, money, clout, fortune, fame, right, all these things, then I start to turn back in upon myself, the self-protection takes over, and then I start hurting and harming people and feeling miserable again, feeling anxious again, feeling overwhelmed again. In many ways, my life is very simple today. Galatians 5:13, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use that freedom for things of the flesh, but use it to love and serve one another. This, I think, is the heart of healing. To be healed is to be free, to love and to serve one another. And that is your primary purpose. That is what we're after. That is where your deep and abiding and profound happiness will be found. And loving and serving it's not always like flowers and roses and, right? Like when I'm serving my 2-year-old, Charlie, it's like I'm changing a diaper, he's screaming. To love and serve him means to try to calm him and, hey, buddy, this is really hard. When I left, he was screaming for marshmallows. I get it, that's how I feel, right? But it doesn't mean it's always this beautiful poetic thing. It's very real, it's very human. To serve others means I'm encountering my own big feelings sometimes. My fear, my anxiety, my embarrassment. But life takes on a dynamic, exciting character when your mission becomes to love and serve God and your fellow man. Where you end up, who you end up with, how God uses you, you will be utterly amazed at how he will use your experience, your hurts, your pains, your wounds, to bring hope and healing and love to others. He shines his glory through your wounds. Just like our Lord is resurrected with his glorified wounds, he glorifies your wounds and shines love and light and hope and healing through your wounds that are given to him to be used in his service for others.